I teach at a Lutheran seminary, which is now quite ecumenical, and I've not grown up as a Lutheran, but I now teach those who will be Lutheran ministers. Interesting reading Nygren also as a Lutheran. When I first heard that the University of Agder was going to have this conference, I heard the words Eros and Agape in the description, and my mind immediately went to this book. The English version is not available in any library in Norway, as far as I have been able to tell, so I would like to make a copy of the English version as soon as we get back to Oslo. I've been reading the Swedish version. And I then decided also to also look at another book from the same time period, the 1930s, by a Swedish theologian in the same environment as Nygren, the book Christus Victor, on the three types of the atonement, classic, Latin, and subjective, or whatever you want to call it, types of atonement. I realized afterwards, after I sent in my proposal, that the topic isn't really Nygren and this book, but the topic is the actual concept of love. I won't be talking a lot about love in and of itself, more about this book, and especially his reading of Irenaeus. I'm aware that I'm kicking through wide open doors when I criticize, maybe even forgotten doors, when I criticize or offer a critical reading of Nygren and his Agape and Eros, and also of Aulen's Christus Victor. These two books are classics and have precisely therefore been thoroughly criticized since their publication over 80 years ago. Both have been immensely influential, at least in Norway, forming several generations of ministers, at least up until the end of the 1960s. So many of my older colleagues who are now retiring were taught theology largely also through Nygren's glasses. I am also very aware that proposing a critical reading of these two classic works in such a short paper is the very definition of hubris. Andrew Louth wrote over almost 35 years ago in his book on the Christian mystical tradition, Nygren's own theory is too highly wrought and too detailed to be discussed here. Yet I have given myself the task of saying something about not one but two such highly wrought theories. Like I said, hubris. I asked Tolstein, I don't know if he saw the email, I asked him if I could see his paper beforehand to see that I don't overlap. And I haven't seen his paper in advance, so there will be some overlap here between what I say and what he says. That's a good pedagogical tool, repeating what we've already heard. We'll say it that way. Nygren and Aulen were concerned with what they called motif research, finding the fundamental, central, or defining motif of their object of study, around which all other ideas, aspects, or motifs revolved. Both wished to find out what the defining motif of Christianity was. And for both of them, this motif was a fully theocentric conception of salvation, articulated either as love, as we heard from Tolstein, or in the so-called classic idea of the atonement, God coming down to save from the forces of evil, from sin, from the devil, in Aulen then. When I read again Aulen and Nygren for this paper, I saw what I see in so many theologians and historians from the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century. People trying to find the essence of Christianity. See the titles of books by Feuerbach or Halnack, Das Wesen des Christentums. Trying to find out what Christianity is really all about. It's taken for granted that everything has an essence. It has an essential nature, and the task of the Christian theologian or historian is to explicate what this essential, genuine nature really is. It was presupposed that Christianity really is something out there. The content of Christianity is given in some way, it has a central motif, and this motif can be explicated clearly. Of course, everyone finds something different when they look for this central motif, whether you're a liberal or an Orthodox, conservative, Protestant, Catholic, wherever you are, you identify different essential natures of what Christianity is, but everyone seemed to agree that it could be found. Christianity, the essence of Christianity could be delineated. My main contention with Nygren and Aulen then and with all these other theologians searching for the essence of Christianity, is that I really don't think Christianity or any concept actually has an essence found out there somewhere. I think I've become influenced by all the empirical research going on around me at my school. I think Christianity or any concept, the concept for our topic or our conference here today, love, is always changing. It doesn't have an unchanging essence. Everything changes, I think, which is why we historians have jobs. Maybe I'm just protecting my own job by saying that everything changes. Although Nygren and Aulen were quite aware that there's no such thing as general or common Christianity, they were empirical enough to realize that there are only particular forms of Christianity. Still, their motif research speaks unabashedly about what is genuinely Christian, in contrast, of course, to what is false Christianity or compromised Christianity or mixed Christianity. I'll get to it in a second why I'm talking about Christianity so much instead of love. I think Nygren conflates the two things. Particular historical forms of Christianity can be, in their view, compared against the real thing. And they apparently know what the real thing is. Is it an intuition like Tolstoy mentioned, some Kantian preconceived a priori? I don't know. When they compare particular forms of Christianity to the real thing, these many different forms then fall short. They fall short of the mark. I find a strange dissonance between their explicit aim of simply giving unbiased, non-normative historical analyses of historical developments. They want to be objective historians. I find a dissonance between that and all the implicit normativity in their language when they speak of genuine or true Christianity. What is the basis of this normativity? We've already heard that they were Lutherans. Both Aulen and Nygren were central in what has often been called the Swedish Luther Renaissance of the first half of the 20th century. I picked up a book from 2009. I didn't bring it along. I had too many other books to bring along. About the Swedish Luther Renaissance and the important role, or the kind of the rediscovery of the genius of Luther himself in the first half of the 20th century in Sweden. And Nygren and Aulen represent an important part of this Renaissance. This book talks about how they found that Luther had rediscovered, to quote, the unique and central feature of Christianity. Or as Aulen himself put it, Luther's greatness lies not in bringing forth a new variant of Christianity, but rather in seeing the distinct character of Christianity more sharply than anyone before him. This is Aulen who wrote about the doctrine of atonement. Nygren and Aulen are very similar here. For both Nygren and Aulen, Luther's thought was a high water mark in the history of theology, and all other periods, both earlier and later, were then viewed against this backdrop. And to approach my particular topic, which is Irenaeus, I can quote this recent study of the Swedish Lutheran Renaissance, where she writes, based on insights from his Luther studies, Aulen divided the history of dogma into distinctive periods, describing the unique essence of Christianity and its struggle against moralism and idealism. Moralism and idealism can then easily be compared to the three variants in Nygren, legalistic religion, Eros religion, and Agape. They both have these three options, and one of them is correct. He divides the history of dogma into these distinctive periods, and naturally the period of Luther, still quoting her, naturally the period of Luther gained a place of prominence, as did the time of the Church Fathers, especially Irenaeus. So, in her depiction, and I agree when I read Nygren and Aulen, Irenaeus was important for these Swedish Lutheran theologians because he in some way seemed close to Luther, and thereby he came close to depicting the unique essence of Christianity. Even though Aulen and Nygren were writing about different concepts, atonement on the one hand, love on the other, their overall understanding of these concepts are very similar. Several years before writing his classic on the doctrine of the atonement, which came out about the same time as Eros and Agape, Aulen wrote a short little book entitled Kristendommens sjæl, the soul or heart of Christianity. And already, this is about 8 years earlier, 1922. Already here he sketches out views concerning what Christianity really is all about. And it's about the God who conquers sin and death and destruction coming down to us. It is theocentric, God coming to humanity rather than humanity seeking God. These views are then fleshed out in his historical work, and you can see the same, this motion, downward motion, which he finds then in those he likes, at least, in the classic Doctrine of the Atonement. For Aulen, the genuine Christianity is seen in this classic idea of the atonement, and it is most clearly visible in certain writings in the New Testament, certain church fathers, especially Irenaeus, and Luther. And other periods in the history of theology then departed from this genuine Christianity in some way or another. Similarly, while Nygren was working on his major work on love, he wrote a short book entitled Urkristendom og Reformasjon, Earliest Christianity and Reformation. He wrote these articles between the first and second volume of Eros and Agape. In this book, he depicts the history of theology as a process of synthesis and reformation. Some pure concept is given beforehand somehow, is synthesized, mixed up with alien concepts, and then reformation occurs, and that pure concept is found again. And he can see this happening all throughout history, greater or lesser degrees, larger or smaller scale, but most importantly for him, this is the story of Christian love. Christian love is given in Paul, agape, theocentric, non-egoistic, and then you have 1,500 years of synthesis where this gets all mixed up with Eros, and then you have Luther who rediscovers Paul and rediscovers agape. That's the schematization that he sees, the big story in Christian theology. In this scheme of synthesis and reformation, Irenaeus then is the one who came closest to getting things right between Paul and Luther, which is why Irenaeus is then important for these Swedish Lutheran theologians. But even Irenaeus fell into the error of synthesizing the genuinely Christian concept of love with the non-Christian motif of Eros. As we've already heard from Tolstein, a particular kind of love is the defining motif of Christianity. Divine, unmotivated, generous love, agape. And as we've already heard, Nygren argues that there's an absolute distinction between this and Eros. This can be problematized on so many levels. One is simply psychological. How can we distinguish so clearly between different types of love? Does it make any sense? In my own experience of struggles with love in my life, I find it very difficult to keep these two concepts apart. I'll let other psychologists talk more about that. Just a second. What interests me more here, though, is that these two concepts for Nygren are much larger than the actual term love would suggest. For Nygren, they're defining characteristics of two distinct types of religion. It's not just love he's talking about, it's completely different types of religion. The first type is humanity's tendency to strive upward toward the divine, and the second is God's merciful love, lowering itself to undeserving humanity. And so these two types of religion, which he also wrote in this book that he wrote between his two volumes of Eros and Agape, he wrote a chapter on tvenne frelstingsvegar, two distinct paths to salvation, where he doesn't really talk a lot about love, he's talking about paths to salvation, but they correspond perfectly with his understanding of Eros and his understanding of Agape. Eros then represents the kind of religion where you're striving upwards, mystical religion, where humans strive for union with God. And the other type, Agape, represents revealed religion where God makes God's self known to humans and saves them even though they're undeserving. Eros is egocentric, Agape is theocentric, upward, downward motion, and so on, as we've already heard. What Nygren implies throughout, and sometimes explicitly says is that it is only agape that is genuine Christianity. And this genuine Christianity is really, really only found in the religious geniuses of Paul and Luther. And then to greater or lesser degrees in people like Irenaeus, who are close to Paul and Luther. And mystical religion, most clearly seen in medieval Catholicism, in the mystics, is a synthesis of these two motifs, Christianity and alien elements. I completely agree with Kaufman that the first volume is the most interesting because that's where he lays out his whole system. But then when he goes to apply it in the second volume to actual historical empiry, reading different church fathers, he needs to change things immediately to make room for what he's reading and then to fit it into his system. And what he does when he starts applying this is that he immediately needs to expand his typology. There aren't only two types, but like we heard Kaufman say, there are three types. There are not only Eros and Agape, but also nomos, law, or legalistic religion. And these are explicitly connected then to Judaism, Hellenistic religion of some sort, and Christianity. And he sees how these are, or he understands these as completely distinct religions that have nothing to do with each other, but they're also all mixed together in various forms of Christianity. And so you can say that the apostolic fathers and the apologists, they take a step backwards towards the Old Testament, mixing up Old Testament legalistic religion and agape. He can say that the Gnostics take a step sideways and mix up agape with Eros, and you have the upward striving of the immortal soul towards God in the Gnostic religion that he sees. And then he goes on and says that Marcion, I guess how we say in Norwegian, Marcion comes closest to representing agape in this early period. And I find that interesting when we were talking about how creation doesn't seem to play a role. For Marcion, God doesn't create this world. God saves us from, or the God of Jesus saves us from the Creator. And Marcion is almost idealized, even though he understands that he's a heretic, but he's almost idealized as coming closest to agape in the first half of the 2nd century. But then he explicitly says that that's the first phase, the apologists and apostolic fathers, the Gnostics, and Marcion. And then you have the second phase, where again, nomos is mixed in with agape, that's Tertullian. Eros is mixed in, that's Clement and Origen. And then you have Irenaeus, who comes closest. And he even has to change the chronology to put Irenaeus at the end as the culmination of the second phase, even though he ideally should come before Tertullian and Origen, lived before that. The picture is muddled when he's reading these various theologians of the 2nd and early 3rd centuries, because they all mix the three motifs together in various ways, but they each primarily represent one of them, nomos, eros, and agape. And I had the same experience as Tolstoy when reading this. There's something fascinating and ensnaring about this clear schematization of history. You see this structure, and it's so easy to understand and easy to follow. But of course, it's far too simple. Reality is never that simple. I said I'd talk about Irenaeus. I haven't so far. What does Irenaeus actually say about Irenaeus? Well, basically two things, like I've already hinted. Irenaeus gets it almost right, nearly preserving pure agape religion, but even he ends up mixing Eros into his theology in the end. So, almost, but not quite. Both aspects can be related to a quote from the preface to Book 5 of Irenaeus' Against Heresies, where Irenaeus speaks of the Word of God, the only true and steadfast teacher, the Word of God, our Lord Jesus Christ, who did, through his transcendent love, and here the Greek is agape, through his transcendent love became what we are, that he might bring us to be even what he is himself. So he came down and became what we are to bring us to be what he is himself. For Nygren, the first half of this quote represents the agape motif, and the second half represents Eros. Because of his love for humanity, his agape, the Word became human. The incarnation is the absolutely defining aspect of the agape motif for Nygren. Condescending love coming down, downward motion. This is very Irenaeus. Through his transcendent love, God condescended, coming down to those who did not deserve his love, to save them. This is genuine Christianity from Nygren. Motion is downward, not upward. And in summarizing this aspect of Irenaeus' theology, I find that Nygren gives a quite adequate reading of central aspects of Irenaeus. He focuses on the creation, God the Creator, on the incarnation, on the resurrection of the flesh, all topics that are very central in Irenaeus. So I don't actually have much to criticize in his presentation of these, in his main presentation of Irenaeus. He seems to have read Irenaeus and read him well. And yet, the word love isn't really very prominent in this discussion in Nygren. When Nygren discusses Irenaeus, the word love isn't really very prominent, and I find that odd given that the topic is love, Eros and Agape. And for me, this just confirms that he's not really talking about love, he's talking about tvenne frelsningsvägar, two paths to salvation. He's conflating these two all the time. Is it love he's talking about, or is it true religion, salvation? Nygren wishes to make Irenaeus a primary representative of the agape motif, but after, I'll admit I did it in an English translation, after electronically searching for Irenaeus for the word love, I wasn't particularly overwhelmed by the number of results. For publication, I'll have to look through the original languages, of course. It would be an exaggeration to say that love is the defining element of Irenaeus' theology. Yes, love of God and neighbor, God's love for humanity are present in Irenaeus, they play a role, but they don't leap out as the defining characteristic. And so when Nygren makes Irenaeus a prime example of agape, I think, like I said, this just shows that he's actually talking about something much more, much broader than love. For Nygren, when he reads Irenaeus and deals with him, his main issue, or the main topic he wants to talk about, is how Irenaeus and the Gnostics represent these two opposite, diametrically opposed paths to salvation. The ascent of the immortal soul to God, or the descent of God into this world to save us. The second half of the quotation cited above, that he might bring us to be even what he is himself, then represents the Eros motif from Nygren. This Eros motif has snuck its way into Irenaeus' pure agape religion. And for Nygren, this is simply the Hellenistic idea of deification, which Irenaeus apparently adopts and weaves into his religion. Nygren summarizes this using a statement that Irenaeus himself never uses, but which is prevalent in many presentations of the Church Fathers. God became human so that humans could become God. Irenaeus does say similar things, speaking about becoming like God, speaking of communion with God, participating in God. But to do as Nygren does and simply equate these expressions with some preconceived Hellenistic doctrine of deification is a drastic oversimplification. Nygren seems unable to relate to language of divine likeness, communion, ascent, participation. He can't relate these topics to agape because they don't fit into his scheme of downward motion. Love is only downward. And if we are to ascend to God, it doesn't fit in to his system. And so he has to say, well, Irenaeus has adopted it from somewhere else, from Eros. And so, to quote Nygren, aspects of Eros and agape, of the aspects of the Eros and agape motifs are woven together in Irenaeus. Like I said earlier, criticizing Nygren's agape and Eros is like kicking through open doors. Nygren has already been criticized extensively. We've already heard that maybe he should simply be forgotten. And he, to a certain degree, already is. His treatment of Irenaeus and especially his assumption that Irenaeus simply adopts a Hellenistic doctrine of deification, is much too simple. That was the topic of my doctoral dissertation from 2009, which I'm hoping to publish this year. Looking more closely at what Irenaeus actually says when people say he's talking about deification. My answer is yes, no, maybe, kind of. It's complicated. Does he talk about deification or not? Depending on how you define deification, maybe. I certainly don't agree with Nygren that Irenaeus is superficially mixing alien concepts together. And that's a trend in recent Irenaeus research, that the unity and comprehensiveness of Irenaeus' thought is much more recognized than it was 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Nygren still operates in a way of thinking where Irenaeus mixes various concepts together. Irenaeus builds a unity in his theology, so he doesn't mix like this. I don't see Irenaeus taking over a ready-made Christian concept of love and mixing it with an alien concept, Hellenistic Eros. I really don't see anyone taking pre-existing anything and mixing it with incompatible types of religion. Reality is much more muddled than that, I think. My criticism of Aulen's and Nygren's reading of Irenaeus therefore has more to do with their method. And there I again agree with Torstein that it's interesting to look at what they're doing rather than the particulars of their readings. In their method, they presuppose several things that I find problematic. First, they presuppose that one can delineate pure concepts or ideas or motifs in history, and that it makes sense to speak of the essence of Christianity as something given, something unchanging, against which particular forms of Christianity can be evaluated. They write of genuine Christianity and of pure Christian love as if these concepts can be defined objectively one time for all. Nygren claims to find 2 or 3 concepts of love running through history that are mutually alien to each other. Aulen finds 3 ideas of the atonement that are mutually incompatible. These ideas seem to float out there somewhere, have some independent existence, and then the specific concrete examples can be compared to this ideal out there. And in each case, one of these alternatives, coincidentally that which is closest to Luther, represents genuine Christianity, and the others represent alien influence. As a historian, I see no straight lines or pure concepts in history. I see no givens, no ideas or concepts or motifs or entities that are out there floating around that aren't constructed and continually reconstructed in history. I guess I can say I'm not a realist. I don't think concepts exist apart from their various messy, concrete expressions in history. What love is, what atonement is, what Christianity is, have been continually negotiated and renegotiated. These are messy, not pure concepts. An apocryphal Einstein quote that I've never found an attribution for, so Einstein probably didn't say it, but I still say it to students, says that if you can't explain it simply, you haven't understood it well enough. Search for that quote, you'll find it all over the internet. Nygren's and Aulen's schematization of history is very pedagogical. It can be explained simply. So one might say that they've understood things. I'd rather follow a paraphrase of something C.S. Lewis said, however, that points in the opposite direction. Something along the lines of, if you can explain it simply, it is probably not reality that you're explaining. Reality is messy, full of ebbs and flows and crooked lines, unpredictable processes of continuity and change. The schematization that Nygren and Aulen present is too simple in an unhelpful way. The most recently published book on Irenaeus by Father John Baer, excellent Orthodox scholar, one of the foremost interpreters of Irenaeus these days, has the title Identifying Christianity. Rather than seeing Irenaeus as simply transmitting something that was given already in Paul, Baer gives Irenaeus a more active role in identifying, both for his contemporaries and for posterity, what Christianity is. It's not a given. Irenaeus is involved in identifying it. For Bear, what Irenaeus identifies is much broader and more comprehensive than any single motif or any single concept. Irenaeus brings together the great story of creation, redemption, and consummation, and he does so by embracing the entire biblical witness, not only Paul, and reducing his thought or the Christianity he identifies to a single motif, to one central concept, is to distort Irenaeus, and I think to distort Christianity. I completely agree with Bear here. I would probably go further, however, and use an even more active, loaded word. I would probably use the word construction. Irenaeus not only identifies, but participates in the construction of Christianity. Christianity, or Christianity's essence or central motif, isn't something he can find or identify, something that exists out there prior to Irenaeus or prior to anyone. He doesn't just identify something that is given, but helps construct it. And theologians and priests and bishops and laypersons have continued constructing and reconstructing Christianity ever since. In some traditions, this involves much less change and disruption than in others, but if there are any absolute truths that I adhere to anymore, one of them is that nothing ever stays the same. It's the nature of history that everything changes. For that reason, I think Nygren's and Aulen's identification of the central motif of Christianity should simply be abandoned. My second problem with their reading of Irenaeus and their presentations in Nygren and Aulen is in the fact that they find their normative basis in the genius of Luther, and then they can implicitly evaluate any given conception of Christianity based on its proximity to Luther. This is, of course, both provincial and anachronistic, and we can happily criticize their subjective readings and normative evaluations that fly in the face of their claims of objectivity. We should perhaps, though, not think that we can so easily avoid this temptation ourselves, thinking we can do better. We also easily become blind to the things that influence our own readings and evaluations, whether they be academic or religious or simply personal reasons. What I see when I read Irenaeus is different from what the Catholic and Lutheran combatants of the 16th century saw when they used him as ammunition. It's different from what Harnack saw. It's different from what Nygren and Aulen saw. But do I really know anything objective about Irenaeus? What I really know is what I think he thought. I don't have any access to the real Irenaeus either, by which I can, just like I don't think Nygren has access to real Christianity, by which he can criticize other forms of Christianity, I don't have access to any real Irenaeus. All I have is my own construction and other Irenaeus scholars' constructions of Irenaeus. I hope it's possible, however, even though we don't have access to the real thing, it doesn't exist anymore, Irenaeus is long gone. I hope it's possible, however, to give accounts that will be recognizable and plausible to others who are familiar with the sources upon which our accounts are based. Together, perhaps we can construct plausible understandings of a concept such as love, or of a thinker such as Irenaeus, or of something as broad and multifaceted as Christianity, without claiming to have found the true essence of the thing we're studying. And so just as I see Irenaeus participating in the construction of Christianity in the 2nd century, I see myself as participating in the construction of Irenaeus, in readings of Irenaeus that I, and hopefully others, will find plausible, at least for a time until some future historian laughs at me, like we can laugh at Nygren. Perhaps the papers throughout this week will help us construct various plausible understandings of the topic we'll be discussing, love, both in antiquity and in contemporary thought. Basically, my criticism is at two levels. I see construction going on both at the level of the topic being discussed, whether it's love or construction of Christianity or whatever it is, I see construction going on, and at the level of the researcher discussing that topic. I don't think things can be identified or discovered or described objectively, but I think together we can find plausible descriptions, plausible constructions. But maybe all this focus on construction is just due to the academic environment in which I find myself.